Isn't that great to hear? You know, the studies show that people typically make their decision if they're going to follow Christ or not when they're in junior high or high school. So it's so important, the work that Pastor Chase does and all of his volunteers. They're reaching students for the gospel at the time where they're most likely to make that decision. And so I just want to encourage you, if you have thought about participating and you want to join Chase, you could either talk to Chase, you could talk to me, and I'll get you plugged in on that. And, I don't know exactly if this is right, but, we get like crowns in heaven. And so maybe if you join youth ministry and you serve there, you just get more crowns because all the work you're doing, you're actually helping people come to Christ. And, is that how it works? Maybe. But you just get more crowns in heaven. Like I was born into this world very poor, and I'm thinking I'm trying to get all these crowns because that way I'm not going to the next world super poor too. Whatever. If that's how it works, I'll be glad when we get there. Well, good morning, church. We're going to be in Daniel chapter 5. So let's open our Bibles and go to chapter 5. And while you're turning there, I want to help us establish a framework for this entire book of Daniel. The book of Daniel has 12 chapters, and it's divided in half. The first 6 chapters are what we would call it's historical narrative. So it's telling the story, historical events that happened. And then the second 6 chapters are prophetic writings. The prophecies that are given in those 6 chapters, the second half of the book, those prophecies came from Daniel during the stuff we're reading in these first 6 chapters. So during that time, he was getting these prophecies from chapter 7 through 12. The reason why they broke it up the way they did is so that we can read through the chronological order of the events in that historical narrative, and then we can go to the prophecies, so it's just easier for us to understand and break down this book. So it's split into 2 halves, but across the entire book of Daniel, there's one clear unifying theme. And it's important that you understand this theme if you want to understand especially the latter half of this book, and that theme is the Most High God rules the kingdoms of this earth. It's mentioned outright several times. We'll see that in our passage today, and we saw it in chapter 4, but it's also illustrated in all of the events that are chosen to be included in the chapters that we've read so far. And when we get to the latter half of this book, you'll see all those prophecies are pointing toward this main point: God is in control of the kingdoms on this earth. So that's the main point of this entire book. Daniel was one of the prophets. He was one of the prophets of the Old Testament, and his book is in the part of our Bibles where there are many prophets. And so when a modern reader hears that word prophet or prophecy, we often think of future telling, like the telling of the future. But a biblical perspective of a prophecy or a prophet is a little different. Prophecy can include details about the future, but the point of a prophecy is to reveal information about God. That's the point. Sometimes it can include details about the future, but the point is not the future. That's not what makes it a prophecy. The point is that it reveals information about God. So the book of Revelation, for example, it's the last book in our Bibles. In the book of Revelation, you do have information about future events, but the whole point of the book of Revelation is to reveal information about Jesus. In fact, the full name of that book is called the Revelation of Jesus Christ. It's not the revelation of future events. The point of the book isn't to tell us what's going to happen in the future, because actually, if you ask 20 theologians, hey, what's going to happen in the future according to Revelation, you'll probably get 20 different answers. So we don't even have a very clear understanding of what's going to happen in the future, except that we will be with Jesus in heaven forever. That part we all agree on. The rest of it, there's probably a different debate for every single other part of it. So, and by the way, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ singular. So I just want to help you. When you're in your life groups, I don't want you to be the one that sounds like a noob. When you say, and you're speaking about Revelation, it's singular. Don't say Revelations plural, because then everybody's going to be like, they don't even read the Bible. They don't even know that there's no S in that. It's a Tion, makes the sound, but there's no S at the end of it. So don't be the noob. Also, Psalms. The book of Psalms is plural, but when you're talking about like one psalm, like Psalm 19, Psalm 23, whatever, it's singular psalm. But it's not that way with Proverbs. Proverbs is plural. There's multiple Proverbs in every chapter. Now you're an expert. So when you go in your life groups and someone misspeaks, you could just be like, hold on, noob. That's not how that works. So you could be the smart person in your group. So in many ways, in the Old Testament, prophets and priests sort of mirror each other. And this is something someone told me. It helped me to understand this. So a prophet stands before the people to represent God. A prophet would be just like this, standing before the people to represent God. A priest mirrors that, where a priest stands before God to represent the people. A priest would present sacrifices from the people on behalf of the people to God. A prophet is given information from God to present to the people. Does that make sense? Hopefully that's helpful in understanding what a prophet is. So a prophet stands before God, stands before God's people to represent God. A priest stands before God to represent God's people. And you're probably wondering, well, where does a pastor fit in that? Well, a pastor stands in line at Chick-fil-A. That's what we do. That's the defining characteristic of a pastor. So the book's divided into two halves: historical narratives, prophetic writings, all pointing to the same point: God is in control of the kingdoms of the earth. Chapter 5 is a historical turning point. So I want to show you a timeline to help us understand where we're at in history as we continue through this book. Daniel was born about 600 years before Christ. And when he was around 15, he was a teenager. What we read in Daniel 1 is that his country, Jerusalem, and specifically the southern kingdom of Judah, was invaded by Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. Babylon then takes Daniel out of Israel and takes all kinds of young people. And actually, it's like specific qualification. Honestly, when you read through Daniel 1 and they're trying to figure out which men to take from Israel, it seems like a checklist that women have on their Tinder profile. They're like, their dating apps, it's like a checklist. That's how I read it. It's like they're looking for someone handsome and smart and has a lot of money. So Babylon came in. They're looking for Tinder dates, apparently. And then they basically take all these men, and Daniel was one of them. He was taken into exile. But the people of Israel were taken into exile. Some of them were chosen to go to Babylon University, where they would be educated in all things Babylonian. And then we have all these events like, for example, the fiery furnace around 603 BC. And then, I call him Chad, Nebuchadnezzar dies around 562 BC. After Nebuchadnezzar dies, there were a few years of his sons essentially assassinating each other until you get a little more stability when Nabonidus becomes king. Nabonidus was one of his sons. He becomes king in around 556 BC. And then he appoints his son, who we're going to find out or read about today, Belshazzar, as the king in Babylon. So Belshazzar is the new king in Babylon when we pick up in our story today. And then around 550 BC, Pastor Wes was born. And so he looks great for his age, doesn't he? Don't tell somebody they look great for their age. If you add for your age at the end, it doesn't really feel like a compliment anymore, right? So, yeah, if you just say you look great, and then let them figure out the rest of that compliment, because otherwise it feels kind of like the opposite of a compliment. Some guy, I was at the mall with my wife recently, and these guys came up to me. They said they were part of some church. They were asking a bunch of questions. They're trying to figure out what church I go to and stuff, and they asked, and I told them I was a pastor, and they're like, "Oh, wow, you look jacked for a pastor." And I was like, "For a pastor, though? What about, like, just a regular person? Like, what about a non-pastor? Like, am I still kind of jacked, or am I, like, kind of dad bod? Or I don't know what he was saying. Like, are pastors normally jacked, or are they normally just really scrawny?" I didn't know if I was offended. All right, so the Persian Empire, after our event that we're reading today, effectively ends the Babylonian Empire, starts the Persian Empire. They rule for a couple years. Then we have the Greek Empire, which was spurred on by Alexander the Great, who famously conquered the entire ancient Near East in record-breaking time. And then the Roman Empire takes over. And the Roman Empire is who is in control when we pick up in the New Testament. Jesus and his disciples. Sorry, this thing is like falling all over the place. I'm just going to wrap it around my neck or something. Jesus and his disciples are living in Jerusalem or in Israel under Roman occupation. Rome is ruling the world at the time. So that's our timeline. I think that's important. Hopefully that gave you enough time to find the book of Daniel. Let's start with verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. We aren't told this in chapter 5, but we know from historical records that the Persian army at this point was surrounding Babylon. Belshazzar's response to an enemy at his gates was to throw a party. He threw a party as a display. It's in his arrogance that he threw this party in Babylon while the Persian army were at his gates. Ancient historians describe these gates, and apparently 17 miles of wall were built around Babylon. Those walls were 22 feet thick and 90 feet high. So these were massive walls that were protecting Babylon. So Belshazzar, seeing his walls, and even the gates were made of bronze, so they were impervious to battering rams and fire, he felt safe in his kingdom. He was so confident that you couldn't penetrate his walls that he threw this party, and that was all in arrogance. And it's interesting, as we read further, we'll find out that God is about to step into history. And it's interesting that the very thing that gave Belshazzar confidence here, his walls, was the very thing that God used to terrify him later in the story when we'll read about that. Bible critics have two issues with these verses, or they had two issues with these verses. First, Nebuchadnezzar is called Belshazzar's father, but we know that Nabonidus was Belshazzar's father. In the Aramaic, that word father can also be translated predecessor or ancestor. And Belshazzar would be in the line of Nebuchadnezzar. He would have been Nebuchadnezzar's grandson. Nabonidus would have been Nebuchadnezzar's son. Daniel is written in both Aramaic and Hebrew. From Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, there's a transition. In fact, the word is used Aramaic, and from that point on until the end of chapter 7, Aramaic is the language that's used in Daniel. Before chapter 2, verse 4, and after, from chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, are all written in Hebrew. And so when something like that comes up, our question would be, well, why is that? Why is just this middle section of Daniel written in Aramaic, but the rest of it is written in Hebrew? And what a lot of theologians believe is that the Aramaic language was the language of the Babylonian court, would have been the common language of the Babylonian court. So many theologians believe that this section in this book is written to a broader audience, not just the Jews, while those outside of this section would have been specifically writings that Daniel wrote to the Jews. The second issues that Bible critics had with this specific section in Daniel was they called it biblically, the Bible was inaccurate. They called it inaccurate because verse 1 says that Belshazzar was king during Babylon during this time period. But historical records show Nabonidus was the king. And that criticism stood for a long time until the 1800s when archaeologists found these Nabonidus cylinders. And inscribed on these cylinders were a history of Babylon. And it showed that Nabonidus appointed his son Belshazzar as co-regent. Nabonidus basically permanently vacationed in Arabia. And he was an absent king, essentially, while his son ruled from Babylon, the capital of their empire. So Belshazzar did reign in Babylon. We've confirmed this. We have archaeological evidence. And the Bible critics, once again, were proven wrong. Verse 3, so they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The book of Daniel opens in the strangest of ways. We might lose some of this in our context because we don't have that thorough understanding of the context of the day. But I want you to consider this. God allowed his nation, Israel, to be conquered by another nation. How strange is that? How bizarre that in that context, it was a polytheistic context. We don't have as much polytheism today. There are very few people groups that are polytheistic, which means they believe in multiple gods. But in that day, cultures, nations believed that they believed in gods, many gods, and they believed that their gods were representatives of their gods, and that when they went to war with another nation, it was my gods versus your gods as much as it's my nation against your nation. And so how weird it would be for God, the God of Israel, to have his nation defeated by lesser gods. That essentially, when Israel was taken into captivity, when they were destroyed by Babylon, it was a message to the entire rest of the world that Babylon's gods were more powerful than Israel's God. That's how the rest of the world would have heard that message. And so think about it from a Jewish perspective. In that time would have been like, what is God doing? Why would God allow this to happen? I'm just going to fix this once and for all, hopefully. Why would God allow another culture, another God, to destroy his nation? That would have been crazy. So in our perspective, we might look at these more, instead of gods, we're not a polytheistic culture, we might consider these more as worldviews. And so we have a godly worldview, and we are often at war with ungodly worldviews. So if a Babylonian was observing our timeline, if they were to reflect on our timeline, they might see our culture and notice the very clear culture war that we have going on today. We have a very tough culture war that we're dealing with today, and that culture war is Marvel versus DC. There are people out there who actually believe that DC is better than Marvel. And they're wrong, but I mean, it's an ungodly culture. And so you have, if a Babylonian was looking at this culture war, what they would see is, oh, you have the gods of DCs, the Bat God and the Super God, right? And this Wonder God. And then you'd have like the Marvels. They would say, oh, wow, those people worship these gods. They call them marvels. And they have all these little figurines, these idols that they worship, these action figures. And they even wear shirts and clothing with their gods, Captain America, on them. And so they would look at that like these are our gods. And that's how they would see it. We would call them worldviews. They would look at that as gods. In the New Testament, Paul says, we don't wrestle against or contend with flesh and blood. We fight against the rulers, authorities, powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces. In other words, in a Christian worldview, we introduce the merits of a godly worldview, and then we destroy the fallacy of the world's worldviews. That's what Christians do. And it's important that I make that clear, because what we aren't called to do, what Paul just said, was we aren't called to attack the person. We're called to destroy the worldviews. And there's a very clear distinction in that. When we in our worldviews forget that every person, whether they believe in God or not, is created in the image of God and therefore deserves dignity because they were created in the image of God, we dignify people. We don't attack the people. We attack the worldviews if we're going to attack anything at all. But what I see from Daniel is that Daniel doesn't often attack the Babylonian worldview. What he often does is he just shows the merit of God's worldview in a way that's winsome and persuasive. Daniel is such a role model in that way. When Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem, he took the gold from the temple. When Belshazzar brings the gold goblets into his party, he's effectively declaring the superiority of the Babylonian worldview. Essentially saying man's ways are above God's ways. And here's how God responds. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. So this party comes to an abrupt halt. As this hand, I picture like the Thing from Adam's family. This hand just appears and starts writing on the wall. And then Belshazzar is so terrified that he shakes his knees. He looks something like Elvis is what I picture. And so you have Belshazzar, the king, who was so confident he was just going to throw a party, who now is so terrified that he is shaking like Elvis. Verse 7 says, the king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Notice he says they'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom, because Belshazzar himself is the second highest ruler in the kingdom, because Nabonidus, his father, was the top ruler of his kingdom. Verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has a spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, or grandfather, you could translate that, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. So the queen reminds Belshazzar that Daniel is around, and he was brought in to interpret this writing on the wall. Verse 17 says, the Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. So Daniel's brought in, and he's asked to interpret the writing on the wall. And instead of receiving this gift or this promotion for Daniel, he refuses it. I want to point this out, that Daniel had a reputation for being someone reliable and knowledgeable. He had a reputation not just among the Jews, but with Nebuchadnezzar, all the other wise people, supposedly, and even now this king. He had a reputation. Your reputation matters. Many of us aren't effective in ministry because we aren't reputable. Have you ever tried to share the gospel with someone and you're telling them like, man, the Lord just really did a work in my life and I've just been transformed. I used to be this way, but because of the Lord, now I'm this way. And they're like, hold on a second, I know you. Who are you trying to fool? Like, have you ever met someone like that? Or you try to share the gospel and they know you too well? It's like you're not effective sharing the gospel because the people who know you are like, yeah, weren't you the same guy that was cussing at the drivers next to you on the freeway? Like last week, I was with you. And they're like, actually, there's a long list of things that, in fact, I wrote it out. I'd like to go through it with you. Here's the issues that you have. Let's just go one by one, right? Like, I've actually been there where I was working with some people, and I had become a Christian, and I was like, man, I want to share the gospel with these people. So I'm sharing the gospel, and the guys were like, hold on. We know you. What are you trying to convince us? Like, what used car salesman tactics are you thinking you're selling us when you are saying that you were way over here, now you're way over here, but we know that you're still way over here. You have some issues, and they're pointing all these things out, and I was like, oh, man, I guess I'm really not that great of a Christian. And I had to tell them, like, well, I'm kind of like one of the lower Christians. There are, like, some really good ones, and maybe they could tell you. But I'm like over here. I'm not like a super saint, like the Catholics have those. I'm a lower guy. So I was trying to convince them, and it didn't work at all. And so another aspect, so being above reproach is important for your reputation and for your ministry, but it's not the only aspect. Daniel's reputation, he had a reputation for being exceptional. He was found to be healthier, wiser, a better learner right from the first chapter. Daniel had a reputation for being exceptional in almost every way. What is your reputation like among others? Are you known for being a hard worker, a fast learner, a wise decision maker? Are you known for being insightful, helpful, honest, reasonable? Or are you known for being a prude, a fun sucker? Are you known for being lazy, a weirdo, reclusive? Have you ever met those weirdo Christians? If not, you might be one. Some people bring joy wherever they go. Others bring joy whenever they go. Daniel thrived in 3 different kingdoms. He was in the southern kingdom of Judah. He was taken to the Babylonian kingdom. And next week, the setting would be in the Persian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. 3 different kingdoms, Daniel thrived. When I was a youth pastor, I taught a 6-week series in Daniel, and I called it Assimilation. I taught this every other year. And what I loved about this series was that Daniel was a teen when we were first introduced to him. He was a teen when he was making an impact for God's kingdom. When he changed the heart of a king, of another nation who didn't believe in his God. He had to assimilate into an entirely different culture with different worldviews, different values. Daniel excelled regardless of the culture, the king, or the country. How was Daniel able to thrive in a non-Christian environment without compromising his godly character? And that's the question I would present to students. How could you thrive in your environment? Maybe when you're at your schools, among your friends. What if you're the only one who's a Christian in your environment? How can you still thrive? How can you assimilate into that environment without compromising your character and your convictions? And that's a question I'd like for you to wrestle with this week. How can you assimilate into your community or into your workplace or among your friend groups without compromising your character, even if you're the only Christian? Unfortunately, many of us have disconnected from our community so much that we're no longer effective to make an impact. Verse 18, Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. Nebuchadnezzar was given incredible power and authority. And according to Daniel, notice this, who gave Nebuchadnezzar that power and authority? It was God. And that is the theme throughout this entire book. But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until. So Daniel is referring to chapter 4, which we studied last week, when Nebuchadnezzar was literally given the mind of an animal. He went nuts, and he was basically out living like an animal. He was completely humiliated. A king humiliated until the point he was humble enough where he declared to all nations in his letter, and this is what the next verse says. He was humiliated until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. Our God is sovereign and has control over the kingdoms on our earth. That's the theme of the book of Daniel. It's repeated over and over, whether it's by illustration or outright, just like that verse. Verse 22, But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot even see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Verse 26, this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. In other words, Daniel's interpreting this dream. or this writing, and he's saying, Belshazzar, you don't have many days to live. We know from history that's exactly what happened. The fall of Babylon is recorded by ancient historians, and this is a quote from them. It says, Cyrus then dug a trench and diverted the flow of the Euphrates River into the new channel, which led to an existing swamp. The level of the river then dropped to such a level that it became a stream. His army was then able to take the city by marching through the shallow waters. The Babylonians at the time were celebrating intensely at a feast to one of their gods, and they were taken totally by surprise. For the second time, Daniel is in a capital city when it is besieged and taken over by another empire. It's natural, I think, for us to, when we're reading these stories from the Bible, that we often want to put ourselves in the place of Daniel. We read about Daniel, and as we're reading, we put ourselves in his shoes. But I actually think it's more helpful for us to reflect on the contrast between Chad, Nebuchadnezzar, and Belshazzar. This chapter presents readers with this question. Are you going to humble yourself like Chad, or are you more like Belshazzar? Belshazzar took the goblets from the temple, and he defiled them. What are your goblets? Have you been praising the gods of gold, or in our context, money, work, sports, travel, entertainment, comfort, indulging on food, drinks, pleasure? We might think, I would never desecrate God's goblets. I would never desecrate God's possessions in that way, the way Belshazzar does, but that's exactly what we do. Church, you are the temple. You are God's temple. God tabernacles within you. When we give in to sinful desires, we take the goblets from God's temple and we desecrate them. I'd argue that it's worse when Christians do it, because Belshazzar wasn't even a Christian. He didn't even have the Holy Spirit living within him, and we do. We also need to humble ourselves and seek God. And that's what the chronicler said in 2 Chronicles 7:14. Listen, if my people, God speaking, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. I think we all agree our world, our nation has some problems, but I think that we have the tendency to think that the world's problems are caused by the non-Christians, that the people in the world who are not God's people are the problem with our world. But this verse seems to suggest that responsibility actually falls on us, his church. Do you want to see change in our schools? Humble yourself, pray and seek God's face, turn from your wicked ways. Do you want to see change in our nation? Humble yourself, pray and seek God's face, turn from your wicked ways. Do you want to see revival in our world? Humble yourself, pray and seek God's face, turn from your wicked ways. Maybe the reason why it seems like there are so many Belshazzars in the world is because there aren't enough Daniels bringing glory to the God Most High. If Christ's people, who are called Christians, would stop defiling the goblets of his temple, maybe, just maybe, God would bless us with leaders more like Chad, who humbled himself and proclaimed Yahweh as the Most High God to all the nations. You know, we just celebrated our 249th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I love our country. I served in our military for 6 years. I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I think that our Constitution, apart from the Bible, is the best document that's ever been written by men. And it protects the freedoms and liberties that all of us enjoy, and to me, that's worth dying for. But even though I consider myself an American patriot, at best, because I'm a Christian, at best, I can only consider myself American light, L-I-T-E, because as a Christian, my job is to bring to the entire world the L-I-G-H-T. Church, you are the light of the world. We might live in a dark world, but you know the light is brightest in the darkest places. You're the light of the world. Your job is to bring the light to the world. we can participate in the kingdoms of this earth, but let's remember, only one kingdom will endure forever. And that's the message of Daniel. Kingdoms rise and fall, but God's kingdom will reign forever. Let's pray. Lord, we just thank you for giving us the hope of eternity. We get to spend eternity with a good king, a king who is omniscient, knows all things, perfectly just. Lord, we long for the day when we can reign with you in your kingdom, when you can reign forever and ever. Lord, would you help us during this time to be better reflections of you? Can you help us to represent our world, to be a light in this dark world? In Jesus' name.